Hi, and welcome to the unit on the respiratory system. Now, it's easy to think of the respiratory system as nothing more than the pipes and air sacs that make up our lungs and the process of getting air in and air out. But the respiratory system is actually there to support the process of respiration, which takes place throughout the body. So, to put this in context, we need to talk about the 5 stages of respiration. Now, those 5 stages are ventilation, alveolar exchange, transport, systemic exchange, and finally cellular respiration. Now let's start by looking at a diagram. So in this diagram, which I crammed into this tiny little board, there are lungs, there's the circulatory system, and then there are the cells of our tissues. And all of these are involved in the process of respiration. The first process of respiration is called ventilation, or the first stage of respiration is called ventilation. And ventilation is the movement of air into and out of the lungs. So it's moving the air between the outside environment and the alveoli, which are the small little air sacs where diffusion takes place. Now, carbon dioxide and oxygen do not move in the same direction in ventilation. In ventilation, oxygen is moved from the external environment to the alveoli, and carbon dioxide is moved from the alveoli to the external environment. Therefore, the directions that they are moving are opposite, even though the same pump is pulling air in and air out. Now, from ventilation, we move to alveolar exchange, which is also known as external respiration. Now, in this process, the gases are moving between the alveoli of the lungs and the pulmonary capillaries, right? So between the alveoli and the pulmonary capillaries. And just like in ventilation, the two gases move in opposite directions. Oxygen moves from the alveoli into the pulmonary capillaries. We want the oxygen to come into the body. Carbon dioxide is on its way out of the body and therefore moves from the pulmonary capillaries to the alveoli. So we have alveolar exchange taking place here. So oxygen comes in, and now oxygen has to be carried to the systemic capillaries. This process is called transport and involves the circulatory system. Carbon dioxide is in the systemic capillaries and has to be transported to the pulmonary capillaries. So again, moving in opposite directions, and in this case, using opposite structures. The oxygen comes from the pulmonary circuit to the systemic circuit, and the carbon dioxide comes from the systemic circuit and goes to the pulmonary circuit. So this is transport. It's movement of the gases between the pulmonary capillaries and the systemic capillaries, and just like we've seen in each stage before this, oxygen moves in one direction and carbon dioxide moves in the other direction. All right, after we've gone through transport, then it's time for systemic exchange, also known as internal respiration. And here we're talking about the movement of the gases from the systemic capillaries to the tissue, or from the tissue to the systemic capillaries. Just like in the other examples, oxygen moves in one direction from the systemic capillaries to the tissue where it's going to be used, and carbon dioxide moves from the tissue where it's produced to the systemic capillaries so that it can be on its way out. After the systemic exchange comes cellular respiration. Cellular respiration takes place inside the cells. You studied this in Bio 23, and it's the process by which oxygen and glucose interact and form ATP as well as carbon dioxide. So oxygen is used and CO2 is produced in cellular respiration, and all of that with the purpose of producing ATP. So let's follow oxygen from the beginning of its journey all the way to the end, and then let's follow CO2 from where it's formed to the end. So starting with oxygen, which is in the outside environment, we go through ventilation, where the air is pulled into the alveoli of the lungs. Oxygen, once it reaches the alveoli, diffuses across the alveolar membrane and across the capillary wall into the pulmonary capillaries. That oxygen is then carried through from the pulmonary veins into the left side of the heart and then out into the systemic circuit. When it reaches systemic capillaries, it diffuses out of the capillary into the tissue. The cells pick up the oxygen and have glucose and use that to make ATP. So the oxygen is gone. Now, CO2 is formed in that process. CO2 diffuses from the cell to the tissue to the systemic capillary. Then it is transported through systemic veins to the right side of the heart and then to the pulmonary artery. And when it reaches the pulmonary capillaries, CO2 diffuses out of the pulmonary capillaries across the alveolar wall into the alveoli. And finally, ventilation moves the CO2-rich air out to the outside of the body. So these are the 5 stages of respiration. CO2 and oxygen both move through all 5 of the stages. They just do so in opposite directions. And it goes to show what the entire purpose of breathing is. The purpose of breathing is not to get oxygen in and CO2 out, though that's part of what it does. But breathing actually supports respiration, meaning that the reason that we breathe is actually to produce ATP.